On October 23rd, 2010, Patrick Thomas, the CEO of Hermes, received a phone call from Bernard Arnault. Now, Bernard Arnault is probably not a man who calls to make small talk. He is the chairman and CEO of LVMH, the largest luxury conglomerate on earth. He's busy hoarding wealth, making small, in comparison to his wealth, charitable donations look grand, and just regular, business and family manly stuff. Bernie tells Patrick Thomas that LVMH owns 17% of Hermes. Doesn't say I'm looking to buy 17% or has been building towards 17%, he says owns. And he calls him to tell him because his ego is absolutely bursting to tell him, and if it were up to him, he would have called him ages ago, but this is the first time his lawyers left him unsupervised, in my opinion. Which brings me to hello and welcome or welcome back to my little fashion corner. Everything said is either publicly available information or my opinion and commentary. I love fashion, and late-stage capitalism is running, well, just about everything, from privileged things like art, music, and fashion to the very basic things like food and cost of housing. So here we are, talking about a mediocre white man hoarding wealth, failing to contain his ego. Have I mentioned this is my opinion only? Which brings me to hello and welcome or welcome back to my little fashion corner. Everything said is either publicly available information or my opinion and commentary. I love fashion, and late-stage capitalism is running absolutely everything, from privileged things like art, music, and fashion to the very basic things like food and cost of housing. So here we are, talking about a mediocre white man hoarding wealth, failing to contain his ego, and have I mentioned this all is my opinion only? Back to Bernie Arnault, as I lovingly call him. Back to Bernard Arnault owning 17% of one of the most fiercely protected, obsessively family-controlled companies in the world, Hermes. He got to this place through a fairly complex structure designed to exploit a hole in French law. It involved 3 major banks, 2 offshore subsidiaries, and a derivatives strategy that exploited said loophole so precisely it took regulators a couple of years to figure out how to close it. And when the mechanics fell into place, the shares had been converted and the position was locked in. Bernie picked up the phone and phoned Patrick Thomas as if he was doing him a favor and not trying to put him down. And how does a fish get caught? It opens its mouth. That phone call is where this story starts, but not where it ends, as what we know more than 15 years later, with a criminal investigation active in Paris, with multiple Swiss lawyers under formal investigation, with a civil lawsuit worth 14 billion euros in the court, we'll talk about it. First, the story of Project Mercury, a scheme that didn't just try to take Hermes through the front door, but one that, allegedly, went through the back, through many a diversion and a paper trail that investigators are still reviewing. Starring the Hermes family, Bernard Arnault, LVMH peeps, background lawyers, and a man named Nicolas Pugh, whose shares worth over 10 billion euros, 10 to 14, allegedly disappeared without him knowing, and some support cast. On the House of Hermes, you've probably heard about Hermes before, at least about the Birkin or Kelly. I feel it's pretty hard not to know Hermes. It's been used as a status of wealth in popular culture since forever. But it probably boomed in that Samantha Jones wants a Birkin-focused story in Sex and the City episode with the most gorgeous Lucy Liu. The infamous waiting list, the one that holds its value better than many investment portfolios and likely all NFTs, a bag that many pretend to get as such investment and not as a vanity purchase. Anyway, it's one of the most recognized luxury brands on earth, and by almost every financial metric, also one of the most successful. Chanel is probably not far off. Hermès' stock has consistently outperformed the broader luxury sector, the margins are extraordinary, and its pricing power is virtually unlimited. Because when Hermès raises prices, the waitlist gets longer. Hermès as a brand is still family-owned. The family structured the company specifically so that nobody else can make decisions about the brand's direction and future. Hermes have always fancied themselves that the brand exists to make exceptional things, and that the moment you start optimizing for shareholder returns over craft, you've already lost the thing that made it valuable in the first place. Fair enough? It's a position most publicly listed luxury companies would privately agree with and publicly couldn't afford to hold to continue to fund their endeavors on their own, so to speak. And also why Arnaud was able to hoard his wealth. But let me try to contain my resentment. Now, the Hermes family itself, there are over 200 shareholders across multiple generations. They probably don't always agree on everything, but on one point they always have been unified. The company stays in the family. They also now have other family names than Hermes, from the founder Thierry Hermes. And Nicolas Pieux, who we'll be talking about as well, is the so-called heir and fifth generation descendant from Thierry Hermes. Jean-Louis Dumas. Dumas is one of the main family tree lines, the cousin who ran Hermes from 1978 to 2006, and is largely responsible for turning it into the global icon it is today. He is the one who introduced the Birkin bag to the world, famously named after Jane Birkin after he met her on a flight. And under his care, Hermes also expanded the product range and grew the brand exponentially. He died in 2010, coincidentally, the same year this story exploded. Then there is Bertrand Pieux, chairman of the supervisory board and the family's public-facing patriarch on the ownership and governance side. When the crisis hits, he's probably the one who speaks for the family. And then Nicolas Pieux. He is Bertrand's brother, but he is not embedded in the business in the way the others are. He's elderly, lives in Switzerland, keeps his distance from family governance. And what we later also learn is that he delegated the management of his fortune to his business or wealth manager. And the detachment from the family is what may have made him the target. Let's talk about Bernice Horde, more commonly known as LVMH. He did not inherit a luxury empire, and his way of conducting business will shed a light on his character. He started in real estate and family had a construction business. In 1984, at 35 years old, he maneuvered his way into control of a struggling French textile and retail group called Bossa Saint Frère, which happened to own, among other things, Christian Dior. I don't know if a small loan of $1 million was at play here. However, he secured governmental support for the acquisition partly on the promise of preserving jobs. The French labor laws and unions are somewhat infamous for how they work and operate. Promising to save this company and not letting people go, and therefore creating a large burden on French societal system, would make waves and secure governmental support. In a 180 turn, he then laid off thousands of workers, sold off the parts he didn't want, and kept Dior. The French press had a name for him after that. They called him Wolf in Cashmere. And I swear, we need to stop giving villain nicknames, because obviously he has taken it as a compliment. Over the next 4 decades, we could have observed extremely aggressive acquisition campaigns. Brand by brand, house by house, LVMH grew into a conglomerate that now owns more than 75 luxury brands, merely by acquiring them. Struggling or not, mostly promising growth to shareholders, Louis Vuitton, Moët & Chandon, NSC, Givenchy, Celine, Tag Heuer, Tiffany, the list goes on and on. If you look up the spider web of brands that belong under LVMH, you might be surprised and or disgusted. His way of working really isn't super creative. Find a brand with some prestige but structural vulnerability inside. Family owned or just starting, undercapitalized, you get my gist. Acquire it, centralize operations, scale it globally, whilst also keeping the brand's heritage intact just enough to justify the premium pricing. Squeeze the last dollar out of your loyal customers on high margin items like trinkets, costume jewelry, small leather goods. And don't forget to laugh all the way to the bank. It really worked in the late-stage capitalism build-up. LVMH's revenue is now in the region of 80 billion euros annually. Arnaud has been, at various points, the wealthiest person on earth. And you could just wonder about the levels of squeaky cleanliness of his business conduct. For example, in the late 1990s, LVMH got into a prolonged and very public battle over Gucci. Arnaud began buying Gucci shares under the radar with the clear intention of taking control. Gucci's management didn't want him as they considered him a threat to the brand's independence and instead entered a deal with the French retail group PPR. LVMH sued them multiple times in multiple jurisdictions, and the litigation lasted years and was only resolved when LVMH agreed to sell its stake back for 1.4 billion euros. It was profitable and also wildly described as a textbook example of using financial and legal pressure as a weapon. In case you're wondering about Gucci's state now, it's still owned by the Kering Group. Or Remember the Panama Papers? The massive leak of documents from the offshore law firm Mossack Fonseca that exposed the financial structures of thousands of ultra-wealthy individuals globally? Did you also have higher hopes for the society to care and or prosecute? Yeah. Anyway, in 2016, Arnault's name appeared in the Panama Papers. The connection in Arnault's case related to offshore structures in Belgium. LVMH and Arnault representatives have of course denied any wrongdoing in perpetuity. I know. Panama Papers' appearance of a man whose name is now at the center of an alleged scheme involving offshore shell companies and Swiss intermediaries? Shocking. And since I said files, yes, his name appears in the Epstein files too. Back to Hermes. By 2001, LVMH had already accumulated over 8% of Hermes on the open market, buying just under the threshold that would have triggered a mandatory public disclosure. Arnault never commented on it publicly, and it seems the Hermes family was aware of it, but not yet alarmed. 8.5% is in control, and they held the majority. But Arnault wasn't done, and I reckon him threatening the Hermes estate was too tempting. The one major luxury house that had never been acquired or compromised, and so in December 2006, he started planning what to do about it. Allegedly, because I haven't mentioned it for a while. December 2006, LVMH sits down with Rothschild to begin planning what they internally call Project Mercury. Rothschild is involved. It can't be good. It is just like that. Hermes has over 200 family shareholders. That can project strength if you imagine the Godfather family, but in any group of 200 individuals spread across multiple generations, there will be people who are less engaged, more financially pressured, more willing to sell than the family's public position would suggest, or just less vigilant, perhaps even paranoid. And if you find those people, build a relationship, convince them to sell and do all that somewhat quietly, by the time the family realizes what's happened, you already own enough to be enough of a problem or impossible to ignore. Or maybe there is a bit more sinister way about it. Nicolas was likely identified as the most susceptible candidate early on, but I'll elaborate on that in a moment, because buying individual shares wasn't exactly the strategy they came up with Rothschilds. LVMH was developing something that will let them accumulate a massive economic stake in Hermes without technically owning a single share and without being legally required to tell anyone about it. The instrument of attack here is called an equity-linked swap, and to understand why it was so powerful, we gotta cover some basics of financial markets. I wish I had Margot Robbie, Selena Gomez or someone else explain it to you, but I'm afraid myself is all I got. And don't make any mistake, lawyers write shit for lawyers, not the public to be empowered, and it is boring for a reason. When you own shares in a company, you have to disclose it above a certain threshold. In France, that threshold is 5%. Cross it and you are required to file a public declaration. Then the market knows, so does the owner and the tax collectors. An equity swap contract is the exchange of one stream of equity-based cash flow with another stream of fixed income cash flow. Not helpful? Told you they don't write it for public knowledge. An equity swap is a bet between two parties, and neither actually owns the stock. Say an investor wants exposure to a stock, but he doesn't want anyone to know. He doesn't want it to be showing up in public filings. So they will call a bank and strike a deal. The bank pays them whatever the stock gains, and in exchange, they pay the bank a fixed rate. And if the stock drops, they pay whatever the stock loses. The bank doesn't want that risk sitting on their own books, so they usually go buy the actual shares to hedge themselves, so the stock gets bought, just not by the person making the bet. And the result is that the hedge fund or the investor gets the upside of owning a position and their name never appears anywhere. And whilst the 5% threshold sounds like an insignificant number, Hermes's market capitalization is almost 150 billion pounds sterling. 5% of that is a lot of money. So when someone tells you a derivative is just paperwork, that paperwork is how $1 billion positions can stay invisible. And all that did not, under the French law in 2008, count as ownership for disclosure purposes. So LVMH could have economic exposure to, say, 4.9% of Hermes through one bank, another 4.9% through a second bank, and another 4.9% through a third. Each bank stays under the limit and none of them have to disclose anything. In the end, LVMH never technically owns anything, and the combined economic interest of nearly 15% of Hermes sits entirely off the public record. And that begins to give shape to the structure. In the first half of 2008, LVMH entered into equity-linked swap contracts with three banks: NextGen, Société Générale, and Crédit Agricole (CIB). The contracts were executed through two offshore subsidiaries, one registered in Luxembourg and one in Hong Kong, perhaps to add distance between the trades and maybe even LVMH's public face. The decision was authorized by Pierre Gaud, LVMH's vice chairman and one of Arnault's longest-serving lieutenants, and the contracts themselves were executed by LVMH's CFO and head of corporate finance. So it wasn't really a rogue operation by someone acting alone. Then each bank, upon entering the swap contract, hedged its own exposure by buying Hermès shares on the open market, and each staying below the 5% disclosure threshold. And according to the later AMF ruling, we'll learn all about that in a moment, LVMH did not just enter the contracts and let the bank handle their own hedging, but they themselves identified the counterparties for the bank's hedging transactions. They were choreographing the whole chain, which banks held what and through which intermediaries, whilst appearing to hold nothing themselves. From 2008 to 2010, this structure ran somewhat silently. LVMH's direct shareholding sits at 4.9 and the three swapped contracts at another 9.3 in economic exposure. In total, 14.2 of Hermes is economically controlled by LVMH, but invisible to the market. Then, in July 2010, Rothschild came back to the table with a new proposal, because of course they did. Pushed the stake to between 18 and 25%. At that level, LVMH would have enough economic weight to theoretically demand a board seat, perhaps block major strategic decisions, potentially be a decisive vote in any contested shareholder resolution, effectively a move for control. But by September 2010, LVMH had mandated Lazard, another major investment bank, to plan the opposite, an orderly unwind of the swap contracts. They call it Project Cezanne. The exact reasons for the reversal is not fully documented in public records, but the timing could suggest LVMH's lawyers concluded that the moment of conversion, i.e. turning the derivatives into physical shares, would expose the full picture, and it was cleaner to control that timeline rather than be caught mid-maneuver by a regulator or leak. So they began to unwind. The reveal starts October 13, 2010. LVMH approached NextGen and Société Générale and initiated the conversion of their swap contracts to physical share delivery. 2 days later, they did the same with Crédit Agricole. And all three conversions happened before any public announcement or filing. Just a small circle of LVMH executives, bankers, and lawyers knew what was about to happen. As always, context matters. In financial markets, there is a principle, and in most jurisdictions, a legal requirement, that price-sensitive information must be disclosed to the market before it can be acted upon. The conversion of nearly 10% of Hermès' shares from private derivative contract into direct physical ownership by LVMH is, by any definition, price-sensitive information. Anyone who knew it was coming and bought Hermès shares in advance would make money when the news hit. As I just said, LVMH converted first and then disclosed the move. On October 23, 2010, Arnault called Patrick Thomas, and simultaneously LVMH filed its public disclosure. 17.1% stake in Hermès, the Hermès share price immediately jumps, and the French financial press runs it as front-page news, rightfully so. The luxury industry and the wider business world reacted with something between disbelief and admiration, depending on who you ask. Anger, if you ask me? Disgust. Anger. LVMH's official position delivered through Vice Chairman Pierre Gaud is this: it would be folly on our part to hamper the success of this great brand. LVMH has no intention of aggressively taking control of Hermès. End quote. So they have just revealed that they secretly built a 17% stake in one of the world's most fiercely protected independent family companies, using offshore subsidiaries and derivative contracts engineered to stay invisible under the French law over a period of more than 2 years without telling the company, the regulator, or the market. And the official line is that this is a friendly investment. Okay. To be fair to LVMH's lawyers, at the time the swaps were entered into, nothing they did was explicitly illegal under the French law. The disclosure rules had a gap which they found and used, which is what the AMF later confirmed, and exactly why France immediately rewrote the rules. My problem with all this is obviously on a moral level. I hate the argument of, well, it wasn't illegal. That's how we got into the late stage capitalism, dear society. Let's advocate and campaign for a change. I digress. Let's talk about how the Hermes family reacted. When the disclosure drops, Patrick Thomas and Bertrand Pugh face two separate problems simultaneously, a private one and a public one. And private one was probably a bit more urgent. The public problem is managing the narrative, reassuring clients and partners, projecting confidence that the brand is not in play. They handle the press reasonably well, and Thomas's statement about culture incompatibility was fairly straightforward. The private problem is the family. As LVMH now holds 17% of the company and is single largest outside shareholder, as such they can attend shareholders' meetings. They can vote, and while 17% does not give them control, it gives them visibility into the company, leverage, and the knowledge that if they can get even a handful of the 200 plus family shareholders to sell, that number will climb. In family that big, spread across multiple generations, members won't be in the same social situation. Some are wealthy in Hermes shares, relatively speaking. Not everyone owns millions worth, but maybe cash poor or greedy, angry, estranged from this family's main line. And the whole point of Project Mercury was that the family's distributed ownership was both its strength and vulnerability. And after vulnerability was exploited and disclosed, moves had to be made. Not that I run that type of a family, but I can imagine the motion to a certain degree. Party number fun was not the cameras, but family communication channels. Probably phones. Everyone needs to be reached, every shareholder needs to understand what is happening, what it means for right now, and what potential risks are they facing. And then members are asked to help manage this, to lock up their shares in a collective holding structure, pronto, which is a financially significant legal step that is then personally irreversible. That is a massive undertaking when you have a heterogeneous group. These are independent individuals. A number of lawyers will be involved to represent each individual's interests. Convincing the majority of them to pull their shares into a vehicle they cannot exit for 20 years requires a stiff drink, or trust and a shared understanding of what's possibly at stake, i.e. the family has to agree that the threat is real and the response needs to be proportionate. Will Pharaoh let the people go? Stay tuned to find out. About H51, the lockdown structure. The vehicle they instated to help is named H51. It is structured as Société Commanditaire, a French limited partnership, and more than 50 family members contributed their Hermes shares to it, getting to a majority representation with just over 51%. The shares are locked in for a minimum of 20 years, so once you're in, you cannot sell, transfer, or offer your stake to an outside buyer without collective agreement. 51%, a permanent majority, gives control back to the family without the possibility of external factors influencing this body. Maths is on their side, and H51 became operational by December 2010, 6 weeks after LVMH disclosed their shenanigans to the market. Bernie, of course, pays no mind to this and pushed LVMH's stake to 21%, applying more pressure. How rich white man of him. It prompts Pugh to speak publicly in terms he probably didn't want to have to use, since until then they were pretty secretive about the family business. He told the press, "After 6 months, we are the target of incessant attacks of the kind we've never seen in 174 years. And Thomas tells Le Figaro that Hermès' culture is fundamentally incompatible with that of a conglomerate such as LVMH. Lawyers gotta keep the hustle, and both sides are making moves, albeit somewhat behind the scenes. Hermès is more of a national institution than LVMH. It's not just a symbol of craftsmanship. That could be said about LV, but not LVMH conglomerate. With Hermès, that's a story of a family still, and independence. And whilst the French government was paying attention to what was happening between these two French houses, allowing one conglomerate to take over a well-established business is still pretty much a regulatory grey area at the time. The Hermès family is not happy to play defense. It seemed they wanted consequences, and in September 2012, Hermès filed a criminal complaint against LVMH. What a criminal complaint means in France. I'm definitely not an expert on the French court system. My best knowledge would be the prosecution of Marie Antoinette, and shockingly, I'm on her side. You probably know that individuals cannot file criminal charges. They can go the route of a civil lawsuit, and a criminal complaint is not the same as a civil lawsuit. It is a formal request to the French judicial system to open a criminal investigation into whether laws were broken. The complaint alleged insider trading and share price manipulation, which are by all means serious criminal charges. And it is my opinion that prosecuting the powerful matters. In France, criminal complaints of this type are examined by a juge d'instruction who has independent powers to investigate, to seize documents, compel testimony, place people under formal investigation, and ultimately decide whether there is sufficient evidence to refer the case to trial. Even filing that complaint is a significant escalation. Just because the collective act wasn't illegal, it does not mean that the steps were not malicious and laws broken. The Hermes family's aim was probably, less about financial compensation and more about getting Arnault investigated as a criminal. If anyone from the family could confirm this, it would be the highlight of my year. On regulators, fine and exit. While the criminal complaint works its way through the French judicial system, I'll call it the AMF, France's financial markets regulator is also running its own investigation. The AMF is roughly equivalent to the SEC in the United States or FCA in the United Kingdom. Its job is to oversee the integrity of French financial markets, that trading is fair, companies disclose what they're supposed to disclose, and also that market participants can't exploit structural advantages to distort prices or hard positions. For example, when LVMH's disclosure dropped in 2010, the question the AMF should be asking themselves is, how was this possible? Especially these two major French companies. How did a 17% stake in a listed company accumulate over multiple years without a single required disclosure? The investigation took nearly 3 years, and findings were not in LVMH's favor. The AMF basically found that LVMH and its advisors constructed the swap arrangement with deliberate awareness of the 5% disclosure threshold, engineering such complex systems with offshore subsidiaries, utilizing the three-bank structure, and careful calibration of each position to stay just below the limit, all to exploit the system indeed. In July 2013, the AMF issued its decision and LVMH was fined €8 million. However, in the context of LVMH, 8 million is almost nothing. In 2013, LVMH had revenues of approximately 29 billion. 8 million euros is 0.027% of that, less than a rounding error on their annual financial accounts. At the time, some of the French journalists noted this, and AMF described the fine as the maximum they could impose under the rules that existed at the time of the offense. Completely inadequate, in my opinion, Your Honor. Let's talk about a small detail. A company named Delico. Among the structures used to route Hermes shares, AMF investigators identify an offshore entity, Delico, and document it as a vehicle used to transfer Hermes shares to LVMH affiliated banks. Delico was a Swiss-registered offshore company, and its administrator was a Swiss lawyer named Alexandre Montavon. The company was not investigated further in the 2013 AMF proceedings, possibly due to jurisdictional limits, as it is a Swiss entity and the AMF's authority is French. At the time, it was merely a footnote. In 2020, Delico will be liquidated, and in 2026, it's anything but a footnote. Beyond the fine, the AMF takes one further step with some lasting effect or significance and rewrites the French disclosure rules. Moving forward, cash-settled equity derivatives must be disclosed in the same way as physical share ownership. So the loophole LVMH used is now closed, and other European regulators will follow suit. Now what? Under sustained regulatory, legal and political pressure, and with the family's H51 structure having mathematically closed the takeover path, LVMH decides to exit. In 2014, they distributed their approximately 23% Hermes stake to their own shareholders in the form of a dividend in kind. LVMH shareholders receive Hermes shares, and LVMH itself holds none. It is structured as a voluntary distribution, which means LVMH avoids having to sell at whatever price the market offers. Instead, they give the shares to their own investors and just simply walk away. Whilst it is an exit, the financial market sees it more as a face-saving move. On paper, the Hermes family won. The regulator acted, LVMH had to pay the 8 mil fine, the loophole was then closed, and Bernie Arnault left Hermes alone. What if one of those weak links had already been found and exploited through a completely different channel? A channel that avoided all these derivatives and banks and ran through a single trusted wealth manager and a Swiss offshore company that has since been liquidated. We've mentioned Nicolas Pugh. Not a household name. he is a true heir to Thierry Hermès' legacy, wealthy by any standard, spends most of his adult life outside of the spotlight. He lives in Switzerland, he is not involved in the company's day-to-day operations, he does not sit on the board. In many ways, he is the family member who most resembles a private individual rather than a corporate figure. For more than 20 years, he had entrusted management of his entire fortune to a Swiss wealth manager, Eric Fremont. Having a wealth manager is not unusual at the very top of private wealth. Ultra-high net worth individuals often consolidate financial management with a single trusted advisor. For them, it is just simpler and more discreet way of doing the business. In a family like the Hermès family, where it's necessary to maintain confidentiality around the family business, the fewer people involved, the better. And so for over 2 decades, Fremont managed Pugh's assets through 2 Swiss firms, Semper SA and Phidias Gestion. Nicolas Pugh alleges that at some point during the years when LVMH was building Hermès' stake, Fremont began transferring its Hermès shares to structures that ultimately benefited Bernard Arnault and LVMH. I hope it goes without saying that he maintains it was without his knowledge or consent. And now I said it. According to investigators, Delico, that offshore company that AMF identified and documented in its 2013 investigation, Delico comes to light here. As the finding published, it was administered by Montavon and was used to transfer Hermès shares to LVMH-affiliated banks, and also liquidated 3 years before Pugh filed his criminal complaint. The shares Pugh alleges were transferred without his consent amount to approximately 6 million Hermès shares, and looking at today's valuations, those would be somewhere between 10 and 14 billion euros. This stake, those 6 million shares, had been moved to structures allegedly connected to the person who was simultaneously waging a public campaign to acquire the company through derivatives and offshore subsidiaries, or at least acquire a significant stake. I keep using allegedly, not necessarily to cover my back, but these are active legal proceedings. Naturally, LVMH and Arnault deny all of it, and no court has found them liable yet. What I have been talking about is the criminal complaint. These are the facts. A company called Delico existed, well documented, connected to both Montavon and the transfer of Hermès shares to LVMH-affiliated banks, and was liquidated in 2020. And now Nicolas Pugh says his shares are gone. The question investigators are trying to answer is, where did the shares go and who authorized the move? And so the case opens. In December 2023, Nicolas Pugh filed a criminal complaint in Paris, alleging the breach of trust, abus de confiance, and misappropriation of assets, détournement d'actifs, directed at Eric Fremont and unspecified others. An examining magistrate in Paris took on the case, and in December 2025, Pugh filed a civil lawsuit in Paris. The defendants named are Bernard Arnault personally, his family holding companies Agache and Financière Agache, and LVMH as a corporate entity. The claim is approximately 14 billion euros. In a pretty standard move, not just under the French law, Pugh asks the court to stay the civil proceedings while the criminal investigation runs. Le criminel tient le civil en l'état, meaning the criminal case takes priority, and its findings become evidence in the civil one, and the court grants the stay. In July 2025, things really take a turn. The examining magistrate places Eric Fremont under mise en examen, formal investigation, and this means the magistrate has determined there is serious and consistent evidence implicating this person. It's not a charge in the Anglo-American sense, but it is a formal legal status with consequences like travel restrictions, possible asset freezes, and the investigation is now formally centered on them. Good old, I wouldn't leave town if I were you. Days after being placed under investigation, Eric Fremont dies in Switzerland. Quite unfortunately is struck by a train, and the Swiss authorities investigate it as a possible suicide. The man was the central figure in a massive financial criminal scheme, a $14 billion civil lawsuit, the man who allegedly orchestrated the transfer, the one person who could have explained exactly what happened and on whose instruction, quite possibly the single most important witness. And now he's gone. In April 2026, a Swiss lawyer, Vanya Megavon, is that a French name? My apologies, was placed under formal investigation in Paris for attempted organized fraud against Nicolas Pugh. 1 month later, a Swiss lawyer, François Besse, was placed under formal investigation. And Alexandre Montavon, the administrator of Delico, is placed under formal investigation for misappropriating Hermès shares for the benefit of LVMH. This is the first time the investigation formally names a suspect whose alleged role connects directly to LVMH as the beneficiary. And a notary is also placed under investigation in Paris. Their identity has not been publicly confirmed at the time of researcher Linda writing this. LVMH publicly maintained "We have never misappropriated shares in Hermès in whatever way is position." Their representatives have referred to the press coverage as a press campaign. Neither Bernard Arnault nor LVMH as a corporate entity have been placed under formal investigation at the time of researcher Linda writing this. Let's step back and look at the shape of this thing. We have two stories here. On the surface, they are separated by years. The first story covers a public derivative scheme from 2006 to 2014, caught by regulators, inadequately fined, in my humble opinion, and subsequently closed. The second story follows an alleged private transfer of shares through a wealth manager, an offshore company, and a network of Swiss intermediaries currently under criminal investigation. The stories involve different methods, different cast members, different legal proceedings, but they still share that one entity, a company I keep mentioning. Delico appeared in the AMF's 2013 report on the first scheme as a vehicle used to transfer Hermès shares to those three banks affiliated with LVMH. The same Delico appears at the center of the current criminal investigation, administered by the same Alexandre Montavon, who is now formally under investigation, alleged to have been used to transfer Nicolas Pu's shares to structures benefiting LVMH. Delico was liquidated in 2020, and it connects both stories across a decade. Context matters. For the courts, this connects an infrastructure, albeit hidden in the footnotes, as it always is. And the timing. Project Mercury started in 2006. The derivative scheme runs from 2008. The alleged private transfer of Pu's shares through Fremont and Delico would have occurred during the same window. And so whilst public takeover attempt failed, as H51 closed that door, there are these allegations that the weak link Project Mercury had identified was exploited anyway, through trust between Amand and his business manager. One of my favorite things to do is to remind myself and others the powerful people mentioned in the Epstein files. Bernard Arnault's name appears in the documents connected to the Jeffrey Epstein case. Arnault's contact details appear in Epstein's address book. There is no confirmed evidence of a direct financial or criminal connection between Arnault and Epstein activities. The world Epstein operated in was defined by overlapping networks of extreme wealth, offshore financial structures, and relationships that allowed things to happen without paper trails. Although don't get me wrong, there is enough paper trail and evidence, thanks to egos, that courts should be filing charges. Still waiting for that. The current Hermes case also involves these structures, intermediaries, and figures who are now dead. The social and financial circles overlap, and whether they overlap in any legally meaningful way is not yet established. Justice? Just any time now? What Fremont's death means legally, as grim as that sounds? He was the most important potential witness in this case. He was placed under formal investigation, which means the examining magistrate had already built an evidence file around him, seized enough documents and financial records to establish the trail. That material did not disappear with him. It remains on the record and is available to investigators and eventually to the court. What is unfortunately lost is his testimony. It's never clear whether a witness would disclose their account of what happened, who instructed them, and in Fremont's case, what he understood the purpose of the transactions to be. Also, no witness is the perfect witness. However, in complex financial fraud cases, a cooperating witness who was at the center of the scheme is often how prosecutors climb from the people who executed the scheme to the people who authorized it. Without Fremont, that climb is harder. The current focus on Montavon, Medjavon, and Bess, the Swiss lawyers, that suggests investigators are trying to reconstruct the chain through documentary evidence, using bank records, corporate filings, wire transfers, and mail that are surely hoping to establish the paper trail that Delico's structure was presumably designed to obscure. Again, a cooperating witness could help connect the dots, uncover secrets, and provide context, but financial fraud cases had been proven on documents alone before. And what proven means? For the individuals under formal investigation, the Swiss lawyers, the notary, convictions under French abus de confiance, statutes for acts committed as part of an organized scheme, can carry prison sentences of up to 10 years, plus fines and asset recovery orders. For Arnaud personally to face criminal investigation, prosecutors would need to establish that he had knowledge of and direction over the alleged scheme, not just that his entities benefited from it. Quite the high bar in French law. It is not unprecedented for senior executives to be found criminally liable in complex fraud cases, but it requires evidence of direct involvement, of explicit instruction, not just proximity. And also, it would make me so happy to see him being criminally charged. The civil case operates on a lower standard of proof, the balance of probabilities. Utilizing available evidence, Pugh's lawyers need to establish that it is more likely than not that the shares ended up in Arnaud-controlled structures. The AMF's own documentation of Delico's role in routing shares to LVMH-affiliated banks is already on the record, which is a significant foundation for that civil claim, regardless of what criminal proceedings determine. Even if criminal charges are cleared, a civil lawsuit can still be a successful pursuit. We've seen that in a different world, for example, during the case of OJ. A 14 billion euro civil judgment against Arnaud personally and LVMH would be historically unprecedented in French law. LVMH could absolutely absorb it financially, as the group market's capitalization is in the hundreds of billions. But the reputational and governance consequences would be severe and lasting. At least that's my hope. And again, it would make me just so happy. The public derivative scheme cost LVMH 8 million euros and some bad press. The alleged private scheme, if proven, involved the removal of 14 billion euros worth of shares from a man who trusted one person completely. One scheme was caught, fined and closed. The other ran for years through structures designed not to be found, and the central witness is dead. If that is what happened, the question is, would legal, financial and social structures allow this kind of thing to happen at this scale and remain invisible for this long? Now what? Part 2. End of July 2026 state of things. The criminal investigation in Paris is still active. 4 people are formally under investigation, the examining magistrate is still building the case, and no trial date has been set yet. The investigation can expand, as new suspects can be added and charges can follow. Eric Fremont is unfortunately dead, and neither Bernard Arnault nor LVMH have been placed under formal investigation, and they deny all allegations. The civil lawsuit, Pugh's 14 billion euro claim against Arnault, Agache, Financière Agache and LVMH is stayed while waiting on the criminal proceedings. In the criminal case, the examining magistrate has 3 main options. Refer the case to trial, meaning the evidence is sufficient and the accused should face a criminal court. Second, issue a non-lieu, a known grounds ruling, meaning insufficient evidence to proceed, or continue investigating, potentially expanding the scope to additional suspects. Given the number of people already under formal investigation and the active trajectory of the case, a referral to trial for at least some of the accused appears the most likely near-term development, though French investigations at this level can take years. If the case reaches trial and results in any convictions, sentences under organized abus de confiance can reach 10 years imprisonment, plus fines and asset recovery, as I mentioned. The convicted parties could also be ordered to make restitutions, meaning Pugh could recover some or all the alleged losses through the criminal process, separate from the civil claim. In the civil case, the critical variable is what the criminal investigation produces. A criminal conviction makes the civil case substantially easier, as the findings of fact from the criminal proceedings carry significant evidentiary weight. As mentioned, a non-lieu doesn't kill the civil case, but removes its most powerful foundation, which would have to be rebuilt by Pugh's lawyers, using the AMF's documentation and whatever documentary evidence the criminal investigation has gathered. It should be interesting to see whether any of the Swiss lawyers under investigation seek some cooperation arrangements in exchange for reduced exposure, or whether the examining magistrate expands the investigation upward. I'm also interested to see whether any additional documentation emerges from Swiss legal proceedings or Delico's liquidation records. I am not worried about Hermès family. Age 51 still holds, and I'm hoping the family backs Nicolas and does not resent him. He's 83 years old and fighting a legal battle in Paris over shares that were allegedly taken from him years ago through someone he trusted completely. Luckily, the paper trail exists. Despite Delico being liquidated, the records were filed, Vermont is gone, but the documents he generated are not. I can imagine Nicolas could really use the support of the family. Are French examining magistrates known for leaving things unfinished? I want to say no, but I also hate to set myself up for failure. I am extremely keen to watch this progress, and hopefully time allows me to cover this fashionably on time. And look what I found. Le Monde published a massive piece on Bernard Arnault, apparently after vetting by LVMH executives as well as the family. Like these two groups are different people, and Le Monde was graciously allowed to speak with Bernie about his court. Their words. Who does he think he is? Louis XIV, but family-orientated? Good man who just wants to run his family business? Ugh, it makes me sick. But I also love a PR campaign to save face. Gross, Le Monde, get better standards. It totally doesn't sound like this exclusive interview is a fluff piece. Again, will Pharaoh let the people go? Stay tuned to find out. If you made it this far, thank you. If any of this or the channel is new to you, feel free to subscribe and hang around. Thanks for putting up with me, and I'll catch you in the next one.